Today we're going to cover Google specific advice for their coding interview loop for 2024. Last time we covered advice for Meta, and in future videos we'll cover that for other tech companies like Amazon and Microsoft. So stay tuned by subscribing. Let's go. So the first thing I'm going to start stating is good engineers can actually fail the Google interview. So it's very important to essentially optimize your preparation and your technique and so on to tick all Google's boxes. But I'll say the most distinguishing thing about Google's process is that for them, the thought process matters a lot. It's not about, here's this problem and hey, go solve it and get me the code out the optimal solution. You might have an interview round, a coding interview round. It wouldn't be all of them. Might be one, you might have none, but where you might not actually have to code out the solution, but the focus will be on like, how do you think through all the information given, use the hints, use the information given to get to an optimal solution or a good enough solution. So that thought process really matters, and for sure communication is important with that. And there's this common tip about thinking out loud. I would say for sure state your thought process, but not all thoughts. Formulate the thoughts, then state it out. You're interacting with the interviewer. Any assumptions you make, state them, because what a lot of candidates tend to do sometimes is implicitly assume certain things, but it's important to state them, like, oh, I'm assuming that all the integers are going to be greater than 0 or something, or I'm assuming that this is only going to be executed just once or something like that, and then the interviewer can interact and tell you, okay, maybe that's not true or that's okay. So like I said, not all thoughts. The verbal means of expressing thoughts can be tricky, so I would say try and illustrate that on the editor being used, so you can type things out and illustrate to the interviewer. Still on this thought process affair, in terms of how you prepare to be good at this, I mean, for sure, this strategy of memorizing certain problems, I don't think it's advice. Don't cram. I think when you do practice, and hopefully you're using Google style problems, so you know the kind of questions they ask, more for the style than for the actual question, you form mental associations. So what I mean by that, I mean, when you're looking at the problem and you're solving it, you're having thoughts, there's like some clues in the question, there's always some of the foundational knowledge, and you're noting these things down so you can revise them, because this is the key to solving the problem. I saw this clue in the problem statement, I know that this is true based on my understanding of whatever theory or whatever, and putting those two together, it made me to think this, and this made me think this and that, and then combining all of that, I want to go in this direction. So a simple example of this would be, you're given some problem, there's data there, and maybe, just to give an example, you have some array and you're storing like timestamps, for example, in a list, and you're just appending. So one thing you might observe is this list of timestamps will be kind of implicitly sorted by time. So if you had to find something in that list, for example, your brain might think, oh, okay, I have a sorted data range, I need to find something in there. So finding things in sorted lists makes you think binary search. You can note that down, so you have that association stored in your head, and you review these associations, and these can become your instinct. So just like if you wave some kind of cloth, it doesn't have to be red, by the way, but cloth in front of a bull, it can get irritated and start running at you. It's like it's instinct, you can't help it. You also want to be at the level where if there's data that's sorted, whether it's implicitly or explicitly, and you need to find what an element in that sequence of data, whatever, you can't help but think to consider binary search. You already have that instinct. So you can do this for the different types of domains related to data structures and algorithms, then that will really help you. Let's talk about coding constraints. So you're not going to be able to run your code. You're probably going to be using an editor, a text editor like Google Docs or something similar. Maybe it has some indentation, but you're not going to have autocomplete. Those shortcuts you're used to with your IDEs like VS Code, not going to be available most likely. And you're going to have 45 to 60 minutes, somewhere in that range. You can confirm with the interviewer, probably the first thing you should do. And you're probably going to work on one question that has multiple parts. It's really one problem with multiple parts, but you can think of it that way. And even though you're not using like a proper editor, you're still expected to write code with correct syntax. That's part of the challenge, unless the interviewer tells you otherwise. And you also need to write correct code, so you need to be good at dry running your code. Again, this is something I've covered in other videos, so definitely check them out. But the advice here is these conditions are most likely not what you're used to whilst you're practicing on whatever platform you're using, especially the fact that there's a human interviewer in the loop. So for example, if you were going to space, you would have to do zero gravity training. Otherwise, something simple like brushing your teeth would be a difficult task. So it's very important that you get conditioned or adapted to these conditions so you can perform well on interview day. And the best thing I'll suggest is you practice on the realistic conditions. And the best way to do that is like a mock interview. Coditioning can help with mock interviews. We've got an AI mock interviewer, and we also got human in the loop mock interviews. Google want candidates who are comfortable with ambiguity, and this reflects in the kind of questions they ask. So you might find that the question appears vague, and you have to really prod the interviewer for clarification. Sometimes they just intentionally don't give all the information up front, so the kind of questions you ask really matter. If you don't, then you're not going to get the information you need to solve the problem. Sometimes you find that their problems are in disguise, so it could be just doing a DFS topological sort to solve it, but it's not going to be obvious from the problem statement. Sometimes it might look like a graph problem, but it might be a simple two-pointer problem. So you have to be very careful and not jump to conclusions straight away. Just run through those edge cases and make sure that whatever you're thinking makes sense. They don't really repeat questions. So a strategy of learning, I've said this already, but learning a specific problem is probably not a good idea. I think that'll be a very powerful tool is when you have thoughts, and I've stressed this, but I'm stressing it again, note them down, illustrate them, illustrate the clarifications, just to make sure your understanding is the same thing as what the interviewer is trying to get across. And one thing you need to be good at is representing, data structures, because you're going to be doing some inputs and outputs for functions and so on, representing different data structures via text. So you have an approach for doing that for, say, arrays, like you can see in the image, or linked lists or graphs and so on. So you can do that very quickly. Because problems are in disguise, you want to be suspicious and, just make sure you're covering all edge cases before you dive into an approach. If you're stuck, state why you're stuck. Pause, think, try and, unblock yourself. But if you're still really stuck, explain your thought process. It could be that, okay, I need a way to get the largest value, with a decent complexity, but the way it is now, it's order n, and if I alter something, I'm going to make some other function slower. Just to state where you are, an interviewer can jump in and, unplug you and point you in the right direction. You can also prime your knowledge bank, so you can ask yourself, okay, will a cache help? Will a heap help? Will the DFS be useful here? Sometimes, if you're really stuck, you might just run through some of the common tools that we use to solve these problems, and maybe one of them will click. So that could be another strategy you could use. One trait or skill, if you want, that would be very useful for Google candidates would be cognitive flexibility. And by cognitive flexibility, I just mean you're just able to adapt to the situation. So if the interviewer introduces a constraint, removes a constraint, drops an assumption, changes anything, you have to be flexible enough to adapt. So that means you can't just be locked in one solution path. You have to be able to think flexibly. And one way to do this is, if you have a problem, discuss, note down the thoughts you have. Okay, maybe there's a dynamic programming approach. Maybe there's an approach that involves using like a greedy kind of solution. Note down these thoughts, and you can follow them in various pathways, assess their runtime complexities and so on. If one looks really bad, maybe you come back to the next one. If the interviewer gives you a hint that puts you in a new pathway, you can have another branch. Obviously, you're not going to be able to draw in tree form interview, but you can express this in a textual form. What's your first approach? What's your second approach? And anytime an assumption changes, you can note that essentially what you'd have to have done before is any assumptions that are made, you note them down. If they change, you have to be able to highlight that and be able to go back and adapt to that new information. Sometimes a constraint is dropped, and that means your data structure choice changes. So maybe initially you used a set to store data, and then you might decide, actually, now I need to switch to an array because of XYZ. So you have to be very flexible and not locked in. One good strategy is when you're like solving these problems and thinking of, say what data structure you want to use, you say, okay, for now I'm going to use this data structure because of XYZ, but generally I just need a way to do X. I need a way to get for example, if you need a way to get the maybe the value in the front of a list, you might think, okay, I need a linked list. So you're saying I need a data structure like a linked list, so that it could be a singly linked list or doubly linked list. So maybe initially you might use a singly linked list, right? And then maybe when more information comes in, you might realize actually a singly linked list wouldn't be sufficient because you need to be able to go to the previous element, so previous node, for example. Then you might decide, okay, I want to switch to doubly linked list. This is like a very simple example. You might have more complex transitions that might actually radically change the initial solution you've gone with. So you just need to be really flexible. And I'm going to repeat this again, don't ignore hint. I see a lot of candidates where the interviewer gives a hint, and that's like the missing link for them to get to the problem. And instead of them to taking a pause to breathe and think about that, let that sit, they just ignore it and they're just locked in whatever they were thinking. So you have to be flexible enough to accommodate hints. So the last thing I'd like to talk about is the default mode network, which is a powerful network of, we can say, neurons in your brain. And essentially, the less focused you are on, say, a task, the more activated this is. And the converse is also true. And the idea I'm trying to convey here is you can actually use this part of your brain to help with problem solving. It's known to be useful for creative problem solving. So if you have situations where you're stuck, there's loads of information floating in your head, and you want to tap into this default mode network, maybe a pause, so you can relax and just lay your mind, just wander and connect dots and see what comes from it. Practice doing this. Like, in fact, interviews aside, just in general, in real life problem solving, if you're stuck on a problem, maybe you've heard of this, where you're stuck on a problem and you just walk away from your desk. Maybe you go get tea or go for a walk, and people have this eureka moment. Aha, this is literally what's going on. The default mode network is more active and is more able to connect dots and help you find insights. Obviously, it's harder to pull off in an interview, but because it's kind of, the activation is like in a spectrum, you can make it a bit more activated and see if it helps. Be sure to check out our Discord community. Definitely join and give us a shout. And for sure, check out the Coditioning platform, www.coditioning.com, and check out our features, all sorts of stuff to help you, whether it's, you want to tell how interview ready you are, if you want to do mock interviews, if we have blogs with advice, we have AI assisted learning, AI mock interviews,